Hi, this is my final project for Dominic DeBrinket's history class. This is essentially social justice in the Salem witch trials, or a more appropriate title would be the lack of social justice, but I digress. For this project, before I start talking about anything, I do want to give some definitions. This project is aimed towards people who have an extensive knowledge on social justice and things like that. So if you don't have extensive knowledge about that, here are some definitions for you. I'm going to be talking about sexism and racism, which I'm going to assume that everyone knows what those mean. Next, we have ageism, which is a prejudice against older people. It can sometimes apply to younger people, but it's typically older people that face the brunt of it. We have ethnocentrism, which is the idea that one's own culture is natural or correct. And then we have classism, which is prejudice against people of a specific social class. Just like all the isms right now. The biggest question I would like to answer is, how can American culture avoid a repeat of the Salem witch trials? Whenever I say a repeat of the Salem witch trials, I don't necessarily mean that American politicians are going to start murdering women for being witches again. I mean this purely in the sense of everything except for the actual witch part of the Salem witch trials. I'm going to be talking about everything but the actual executions of the so-called witches, because even though the Salem witch trials are greatly known for being called a mass hysteria, it wasn't that mass to begin with, and it wasn't quite as dramatic as a lot of people like to say. I will have 3 different main points in this project. They are going to be the political, social, and environmental aspects of essentially everything that was going on within this 2-ish year span, maybe even less than 2 years, give or take. For the political aspects, I'm going to be mostly talking about the division of the secular and sacred. This pissed off a lot of people whenever American government first started trying to separate the secular and sacred. For the social aspects, we are going to be talking about all the isms I defined earlier. And then for environmental, we are going to be talking about natural disasters, poor crops, and anything bad that happened in nature. And of course, just like how intersexual feminism is, all of these are going to be intersecting each other. A lot of these are going to be tying into each other, so this is why I chose to do a podcast and to not write it out, because I feel like I would confuse too many people by writing it out. I have 7 different sources that I have referenced in this project. I will put them in whatever description I have. For my first source, it's this article titled "The Salem Witch Mania." It was written by Benjamin Ray. This essentially talks about Tituba and her role in it. If you don't know who Tituba is, she was essentially the first person to be accused of being a witch during the Salem witch trials. She was sort of the jumping off point for this hysteria. Basically, at this time, the government was trying to not so much divide, but take out the church or take out religion from politics. Actually, at the end, I think, of this article, one of these articles I have, it says that the government never asked for help from the church again, because they were like, yo, you can't keep on murdering all these people because you think that they're witches. So essentially, this entire article goes over how that separation, or that attempted separation of the secular and sacred, triggered this entire panic. If you know anything about people who are secular, who are religious, especially with these Puritans, the Puritans and the separatists being butting heads this entire time, this does bring in a little bit of the ethnocentrism, or the social aspect, which is my second point. But we'll go into that in a second. Essentially, one of the main reasons why the trials stopped completely was because it doesn't ever say whose wife, but somebody's wife got accused, and they were like, "Hey, I'm a very important person. You can't just accuse my wife of being a witch because she's also important." And so basically, in the end, the country ended up kind of distrusting the Puritan church, or not just the Puritan church, just churches in general, churches in politics. My second source is another article written by Carter Pittman, and it's called "The Colonial and Constitutional History of the Privilege Against Self-Incrimination." Basically, this also goes into more of the secular and sacred, Puritans and separatists clashing. This article also covers, a lot of ethnocentrism, which goes into my second point, which is the social aspects. The social aspects, at least I'm more well adapted to identifying these social issues during this time period. Not during this time period specifically, but you know what I mean. For this part, there's going to be a whole lot of isms, and yeah. So we go into this next article. I don't know how to pronounce their first name, so I'm going to be referring to them as their last name, which is Reed. This article is titled "Deep Culture in Action, Resignification, Synecdoche, and Meta-Narrative in the Moral Panic of the Salem Witch Trials." This author introduced a very good topic that I feel like really ties this whole thing together, and it explains a lot about why exactly the Salem Witch Trials happened. The author essentially calls this the both and structure, with the word both signifying witches, and also a larger moral crisis. This moral crisis, of course, would be different depending on who exactly, because everyone's morals is different. In this moral crisis, we are talking about the Puritans' idea of a moral crisis. So obviously their idea and our idea is going to be very different of moral crises. But anyway, basically the short end of it is women in power is the moral crisis. This goes more into sexism, because yes, there were a handful of men who were accused of being witches. I'm pretty sure there was only one man who was put to death over it. I think that was the one that was stoned to death. But other than that, everyone else was a woman who was accused of being a witch. So that's just a little interesting, a little fun sexism. This is a primary resource I have. It is Thomas Brattle, Letter on the Salem Witchcraft Proceedings. Basically, this is Thomas Brattle talking about how much he hates women. It's just him going on about how sexist he is. My next source is the examination of Rebecca Nurse. This entire examination is just the examiners manipulating Rebecca Nurse into pleading guilty. Basically, this was the only written, examination I could find, like a transcript of an examination. But this is just a transcript, and if these people knew that their conversation was being transcribed, so if the examiner knew that this whole examination was being transcribed, I want to know what happened in the examinations that weren't transcribed. How much more manipulative were they? Were the people who were accused and pled guilty of being witches, who were inevitably put to death, were they also manipulated as bad as Rebecca Nurse? Probably, like, were they manipulated even worse? It's just extremely sad to know that these women were most likely outcasts. They were most likely women. They were most likely people of color, probably different social classes. We're going to be going into the environmental aspects of this. The social aspects are still going to be having an impact on the environmental aspects, or vice versa. The environmental will be having impacts on the social aspects. But anyway, basically, this next source I have is by Edward Miguel. It is called Poverty and Witch Killing. Basically, poor people were killed or executed at a disproportionate amount than people who weren't poor and rich people. This article also goes over how old women were accused a lot, mostly like older women, and they were used as scapegoats. This article, this article was actually the first article I could find that used the term scapegoat, which I'm really surprised about, because scapegoat, I feel like, could have been used in Deep Culture and Actions, in that article, in the both and structure. Essentially, witchcraft was just seen as a scapegoat for all the other issues that were going on in the surrounding areas of Salem. So basically, whenever they were used as scapegoats, the scapegoatiness was for the environment. If the environment went wrong, if there would be bad weather, if crops would turn out bad, it was essentially blamed on older, decrepit poor women. And then into my last source. This article is written by Richard Latner, and it's called The Long and Short of Salem Witchcraft, Chronology and Collective Violence in 1692. This also has a big part of the social aspects to it. This was the first time that I had actually found out that that these accusations of witches weren't just happening back to back to back. There was actually 2 waves of witch accusations, or witch hunts, basically. The accusations first started up in late winter, early spring of that year of 1692. And they died down during the summer, and then around fall, it picked back up again. And then by winter, it had run its course, and that was whenever everyone's kind of stopped taking this whole witch thing seriously. And this also talked about how divorced older poor women were accused of being witches more often than anyone else. And yeah, that's the end of my podcast. Have a good one.